Hello and welcome to week 1. Wanted to talk today a little bit about classifying cost for service, merchandising, and manufacturing companies. Cost can be classified as either direct or indirect. A direct cost is easily and cost-effectively traced to a cost object. A cost object is anything for which managers need a separate breakdown of its component cost. Some examples of cost objects are a product, a department, a sales territory, or an activity. In manufacturing, cost objects are usually units of product. Indirect cost, on the other hand, cannot be easily or cost-effectively traced to a cost object. The salary of the production supervisor is an example of an indirect cost. The production supervisor manages the factory operations for all of the products that the company manufactures. Therefore, it's difficult to trace the cost of the supervisor to a specific product. A manufacturer's product costs will include both direct and indirect cost. Looking at the slide here, we have product cost across the top, and then at the bottom you have direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So your direct costs are your materials and your labor. They can be directly traced to the product. Okay, and we say they are traced to a cost object. That could be the product, it could be a department, it could be a sales territory, or an activity. The simplest thing is the manufacturing. You have a product. You can see the material directly going into the product, and you can see the direct labor going into the product. Everything else that's not direct material and not direct labor, we're going to classify as manufacturing overhead, things that cannot be traced to a cost object directly, but in some way they are necessary and indirectly affect the product. So the example given was the production supervisor. That's an indirect cost. He manages the factory operations, and that manager is necessary. He's not directly involved in producing and making the product, but he is necessary, so he's indirectly responsible. All right, let's move to the next slide and talk about product costs. So product costs are classified into 3 categories for manufacturing companies. You have direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Direct material, this consists of the raw materials that are converted into the finished product. Direct materials can be easily and cost-effectively traced to the product, so they're considered to be a direct cost. Direct labor is the labor of the employees who convert those raw materials into finished products. Direct labor is also a direct cost. Direct labor, it's considered a direct cost because it can also be easily and cost-effectively traced to the product. Manufacturing overhead refers to indirect manufacturing costs that cannot be easily traced to a specific product. Manufacturing overhead includes all manufacturing costs other than direct materials and direct labor. So in other words, it includes all of the supporting production activities. Manufacturing overhead is also sometimes called factory overhead and indirect manufacturing cost. It's important to be able to distinguish between direct and indirect materials and direct and indirect labor. Indirect materials are materials used in making a product, but whose cost either cannot be conveniently traced directly to a specific finished product, or they're not large enough to justify tracing to a specific product. Indirect labor is a labor cost for activities that support the production process, but either cannot be conveniently traced directly to a specific product, or they're not large enough to justify tracing them to a specific product. Okay, so let's look at the slide here for just a minute. Direct materials, that's pretty easy. It's the raw material that goes into making the product. Direct labor is the labor of those employees who use the raw material to make the product. Those two are typically pretty easy for students to follow and understand. What typically hangs people up is the manufacturing overhead, the indirect product cost associated with production. This includes indirect material, indirect labor, and then factory costs for rent, utilities, insurance, depreciation, anything having to do with the factory. That is the key. When you're trying to decide, is this a product cost and how do I classify it? Ask yourself, does it have to do with the factory? If it doesn't have to do with the factory, the answer is going to be probably no. It will be selling and administration rather than a factory cost. So just remember that. It is key when you're working on your homework and things like that and you come across a question, you're having to decide if something should be classified as manufacturing overhead. Ask yourself, does this have anything at all to do with the factory? If you're paying rent on a factory, then it's manufacturing overhead. If you're paying rent on a building that you house your administrative staff in, that is not manufacturing overhead, okay, because it's administrative. It's not having to do with the factory, okay? So always think of that. Is it a cost associated with the factory? So this would also include things like depreciation on the factory, not depreciation on the administrative building, okay, where you house your secretaries or whatever. Also, one that I've seen hang students up is sometimes you have to hire security guards to guard the factory. That would be a manufacturing overhead cost because it's necessary to guard the factory, to guard the product. So you have to relate whatever cost it is, you have to be able to relate it pretty closely to the factory or the product. Okay, if the business has a separate administrative building, then the rent for that, the utilities, the insurance, and all of that would not be considered manufacturing overhead. It would be a selling and administrative expense. So always stop and ask yourself, is this factory related? Is it production related? Or is it administrative? And that's how you would separate those. Okay, so let's look at this slide here, 16-6. And this shows period and product cost for Smart Touch learning. If it isn't a product cost, then it's a period cost. Okay, you see we have selling and administrative here. And then under product, direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Okay, so depreciation on manufacturing equipment. That's manufacturing overhead because it's equipment used in manufacturing the product. Depreciation on office equipment. That is selling and administrative because it's office equipment. It's not manufacturing equipment. It's not factory equipment. It's office equipment for your selling and your administrative staff. Okay. This is the thing that hangs students up the most. So that's why I'm kind of hanging on that. Separating the cost between period and product. Advertising. Advertising is not really used in production. It's used to sell the product. So that's a period cost. We're going to expense the period cost in the period in which they are incurred. Okay? We're not tracing them to a product. All right? We are expensing them in the period in which they are incurred. Property taxes and insurance on the office. That would be a period cost, selling and administrative. Property taxes and insurance on the factory, that's going to be manufacturing overhead. The production supervisor's salary, that is manufacturing overhead. It is the production supervisor. He's supervising the production of the product, okay? He's not directly involved in making the product. He's not providing the labor. He's not direct labor. He's supervising. So he's indirectly affecting the production, okay? So the production supervisor's salary is going to be manufacturing overhead. The CEO's salary is selling and administrative, okay? Because the CEO is not in the factory more than likely. Maybe he walks through occasionally, but he's not there on a daily basis. Okay, so you see how you have to kind of make those distinctions in your mind. The CEO, he's managing everything. He's overseeing everything, not just the factory. So we're going to call him period costs. Wages for the assembly line workers, that's direct labor. Batteries, processors, and other materials used in making tablets, that's direct material. Then you have manufacturing supplies. We're going to call that manufacturing overhead because it's, necessary but not direct material, okay? Freight cost on the purchase of materials, that is always associated with the material, so we'll call it direct material. Delivery expense, that would be like to deliver products that are being sold. We will call that selling and administrative. Okay, and then finally, in order to make cost information more useful, product costs for manufacturing companies are sometimes combined in different ways, depending on the manager's needs. Prime costs combine the costs of direct material and direct labor. They're prime. Prime costs are used by managers and organizations where the majority of the cost is associated with labor instead of machine hours. Conversion costs are a combination of direct labor and manufacturing overhead. When the manufacturing process is machine intensive, managers may want to focus on the total conversion cost rather than track direct labor and materials and manufacturing overhead separately. So looking at prime and conversion costs, prime costs combine the direct cost of the direct material and the direct labor. They're prime. Conversion costs are the costs used to convert the raw material into finished goods. Direct labor plus your manufacturing overhead. So conversion costs are that direct labor and that manufacturing overhead. Those are the costs that are necessary to take the raw materials and convert them into a product. All right, so that's all I have today for cost. Review the video. I'm going to post it in the discussion, and I'm going to post a question for everyone to discuss and answer in the discussion. All right, so I'll see you over there.